All right, so this is our social change historical context presentation over the civil rights movement.
To start off with an overview of the civil rights movement, it was an organized effort by Black Americans to end racial discrimination and gain rights under United States laws that were already established. To start, President Lincoln, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which was then coded into the law as the 13th Amendment. Civil War helped to abolish slavery, but to this day, it didn't end discrimination against Black people. And by the mid 20th century, Blacks had went through enough um, when it comes to racism in the South. Next slide. To continue the overview of the civil rights movement, along with white Americans, Black Americans, they organized nonviolent protests, which mobilized and lasted for over 2 decades. Despite having slavery abolished and getting legal gains from African Americans, the Jim Crow segregation arose in the South, and African Americans fought in segregated military, which was being exposed to U.S. propaganda. On next slide shows the contribution to society that the civil rights movement had, being the resource building within communities. Educational disparities still exist. Disparities being the great differences, they still exist within African American students. When there's equal opportunity for everyone, there's equal recognition. So I feel that everyone gets the equal recognition when the opportunity presents itself. Schools can't do it alone. We need the help of caring adults and those seeking change to improve the community and improve the South itself. And when the gap of opportunity is large, there's a large gap for people to achieve and become greater people in life. On the next slide, it shows just the historical landmarks during the movement. One of the most popular being the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, Little Rock Nine, the death of Emmett Till, and the Voters' Right Act of 1965.
For our first C, we have commitment. One important but severely overlooked member of the civil rights movement is Claudette Colvin. At 15, she refused to give up her seat for a white woman. There were many factors that influenced her to make this bold decision. As for her personal experiences and beliefs, she believed that since she had paid her bus fare, the white woman, she deserved to sit in any seat she liked. She had learned and knew her constitutional rights as a United States citizen, and Colvin was a member of the NAACP Youth Council. As for external influences, she was heavily influenced by history heroines, and she was angry that a student at her school had been accused and later executed for allegedly raping a white woman. Her choice resulted in her getting arrested, but her acts of courage did not stop there. Colvin also served as a plaintiff on the case Browder versus Gale. Next slide. As for collaboration, we have the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Incorporated Fund, also known as the LDF, which is the first civil rights law firm established in the United States. The formation of this team included Thurgood Marshall, who was the chief of the firm, and three important figures that he hired: Robert Carter, Franklin Williams, and Constance Baker Mortley. Each lawyer brought their own strengths and worked in both similar and different areas of civil rights. Carter served as an assistant special counsel for Marshall and won many cases. Most famously known one that he worked on was Plessy versus Ferguson. Williams also served as an assistant special counsel and worked on cases involving school desegregation, open housing, and employment for Black people. Motley was the first African-American woman to be appointed in the NAACP legal team, and some of her most famous cases include representing Dr. Martin Luther King and the Freedom Riders. This team also worked on Marshall's most famously known case, Brown versus Board of Education. It can be assumed that Marshall had established a trust in these lawyers and made the decision to have them follow him into his biggest endeavor. Within this group, at least over 100 civil rights cases had been handled, and most of them had been won. The Black Power movement, also known as Black Panthers, had a major influence on the civil rights movement. This movement was made up of Black men and women that believed that more action needed to be taken than just peaceful protests. The aims for this movement were social, economic, and political power for Black people. Their values were radical pride, self-autonomy, and self-determination, all influenced by Malcolm X. And their visions were to build up the Black community, combat systematic racism, and achieve freedom, justice, and equality. Most of their visions were eventually achieved through political reform and the creation of social programs. And the overall purpose provided by this movement has influenced many other organizations that are continuing to fight for their own rights. For our next C, we have controversy with civility. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were two very important figures in the civil rights movement. When mentioned together, they are mostly known for having extremely polarizing viewpoints, one for peace and the other for violence. During the beginning of this movement, Dr. King and Malcolm X had low civility but high controversy, where they would resort to throwing insults at each other and dismissing each other's methodologies. It was only at a press conference that the two men were able to speak with each other, and it is thought that their convergence helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964. After Malcolm's assassination, King started to implement some of Malcolm's reasons into his own speeches. Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King walked different paths that eventually came one in order to be able to see eye to eye for the better of society.
Another C of social justice is consciousness of self. And Daisy Bates represents that as she organized the Little Rock Nine in 1957. The way she used consciousness of self is she was consistently mindful and self-aware of the danger that she was putting the students she chose in. And instead of just using them, she was actively engaging with them and protecting them. And she drove them to school. She protected them against protesters. She advised the group. And she also joined the school's parent organization. And she was awarded the Medal of Freedom in 1999. Citizenship. In 1957, 60 Black pastors and civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King, met in Atlanta, and they put together a nonviolent protest against racial discrimination. And Martin Luther King and the other civil rights activists used citizenship and became connected with the communities, leaders within the community and society in leading many protests. And one of the most famous protests is March on Washington. And again, Martin Luther King contributed by his I Have a Dream speech. Then the last C, congruence. The Freedom Riders were civil rights activists who participated in bus trips throughout the South in 1961. And their tactics included using whites-only restrooms and lunch counters at bus stations across Southern states. They showed congruence because they stuck to their values even when they were attacked multiple times and the results were horrific.
Okay, so for our personal interview, I interviewed my Nana, and she was born in the 50s and lived her childhood, teenage years of the 60s. And yeah, she just had some great points on just racial inequality and things that her and her family had went through. So this is her in her teenage years, and then of course this is me and her in the middle, and that is her on the left end. So I asked her to start out with was she involved in any of these Black-led organizations like NAACP, CORE, SCLC, or SNCC, and she was a part of Operation PUSH, and PUSH stands for People United to Serve Humanity. It was led by Reverend Jesse Jackson, and they would go to their church and rally with the church. And the goals of PUSH was to increase job security for African Americans, organize those that didn't make a livable income and find them places to stay, and support Black-owned businesses, which we see a lot more in today's days with Black Lives Matter as well. And overall, they were just involved in spreading the message of what the organizing was trying to convey about Black lives. And I also asked her how are the interactions among her culture and race different now than they are today. And so far, it's just been so many new rights that have been granted from the time she was a child to now. Um, but she does say it's somewhat the same. Just now there's more of a bigger stance behind Black people. So we're seeing people from all different races standing up even more. And not that, white people weren't standing up back then, but it's just there's even more of a bigger category of people that are standing with us. And that they won't tolerate the lack of equality that we're getting put through. She said it's not like it is back then, but we're still fighting almost the same situation. Equality is being treated as a human being, and to be given the same rights is all we want. And we still haven't gotten there, is what she told me. It was so segregated in the 60s because people didn't understand the different socioeconomic differences. All that did was just push those in need further back and further away from others. So, really, the socioeconomic differences are what kind of pushed people away, and how we still have kind of segregated communities now is something that she saw a lot back then. And another big question I asked her was, has she ever experienced any form of racial separation in her lifetime? And she said, oh, yes, there have been many, but one story in particular sticks out to her. So she was on the way to church with my mom and my uncle, and they were in kind of an old car, and it broke down quite frequently, she told me. But of course, this time on the way to church, it broke down as well. It stopped on the highway, and she was standing there for about 10-15 minutes and nobody was pulling over to help her. So she decided to cross the guardrail to get out to get some help. And two men came out of the building she was heading towards, one with a dog, and they asked her very aggressively, "Where are you going?" And she told them that the car had stopped and she was looking to use a phone to get some help. But instead of offering, all they told her was, "Do you know what we call this dog?" And they said they called it Blackie. And so she immediately knew this wasn't a good situation to be in. And, he was kind of standoffish and just told her to go in and use the phone. But she decided that she did not want to go in and be a part of the situation, especially with her children. And really, she just told me she was really hurt because it was a Sunday. She was on her way to church. She was dressed nice. And she just really was thinking, how could someone be so negative to a young boy and a woman? And, of course, she didn't go in, but she did call the mayor's office to report it because she just didn't want anybody else to experience it. And just for her to go through it is really something that instigated her to be a part of changing the way that things were. And so I also asked her what was maybe a memorable event from the civil rights movement, and she really just liked the tools she was given and the leaders like Jesse Jackson, Malcolm X, and Ralph Abernathy. She really was inspired by Angela Davis. She was part of the Black Panther movement. She really told me how she remembers her getting arrested and just standing up over and over again for what she believed in. Um, and she just truly loved learning about everything from them and speaking her truth. And then I asked her how she felt about the Black Lives Matter movement today, and she thinks it's wonderful. They have such great speakers from an array of different people of all ages, and she's all for it. She does think that we should try to become more as one on issues, just because sometimes not everyone is taking up the same perspectives. It's sometimes different perspectives. But she does say gun violence shouldn't just be on anyone. But yes, we do have to highlight and show that they are killing Black people at a higher rate. We still have to keep fighting for that and equality of others. And I think lastly, I asked her, is racism still alive today? And she said, oh, yes, to this as well. It has changed the way that it used to be when it was just quote unquote black and white. But racism on so many different levels is still alive. It can be used through language to hold anyone back. And when they can still get away with it, it's kind of like the laws that have been set in place. Laws haven't been changed, like incarceration rate, things that people are getting put away in jail for, like, definitely can be changed, but it's just put in place to hold people back. We still need things changed. The Constitution still has things about slavery in it, and it's an issue. Black people still don't get the same equality in living or voting, and it's still very much alive. It's crazy to think that I think who would be doing these things to Americans in America, but that's what's happening. It's domestic. It's people living right next to you in your community. And just speaking with her definitely opened my eyes up a little bit more, hearing stories from her, and definitely just knowing that there's so much more to be fought for.
Up next, we have the synthesis of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, it started in the 1950s to campaign against racial discrimination and segregation while also fighting for equal rights for African Americans. The civil rights campaigns had two sides. The nonviolent peaceful protests were led by Dr. Martin Luther King, while the radical violent side was led by Malcolm X. The civil rights movement had major leaders like Rosa Parks, John Lewis, Bayard Rustin, James Farmer, Hosea Williams, Whitney Young Jr., MLK, and Malcolm X, among others. The civil rights movement had an immense impact on social change. It prompted for a widespread change within society and is known as one of the most successful social movements in American history. This is how the civil rights movement has changed the way that we live today. Even though racism has not been fully eradicated, and it most likely never will be in our lifetimes and our ancestors' lifetimes, the civil rights movement affected a lot of change in inequality of races over the years. Just like in the 50s and 60s, movements against racism seek electoral, political, and policy reforms, with modern movements like Black Lives Matter gaining more global support each and every day. The civil rights movement had also a large impact on how different groups have fought for their rights and continue to do so. Examples of these groups would be women's rights, immigrants' rights, and the LGBTQ plus community rights. The civil rights movement is still working today to fix the inequalities in our society. It is working to give everyone the same opportunity and equality. Next, I'm going to be explaining how the civil rights movement has changed the way that we lead today. One of the main aims of the civil rights movement was to fight for political representation of the African Americans and gain voting rights. Today, we see an increased voting participation by the African American community, with even an African American, Barack Obama, having won the presidency in 2008. In today's White House and Senate, we're also seeing the fruits of the labor of the civil rights movement by having our first African American president, vice president, and Kamala Harris, and our newly elected African American Senator, Raphael Warnock of the Democrat Party. The civil rights movement also had a positive impact on the ability of citizens of the African American community to demand for their rights and demand accountability from their leaders. The new age leaders of the civil rights movement now seek to address a broader agenda of eliminating social and economic disparities among a diverse group of new and old minorities. Therefore, more groups of the oppressed in society are recognized. Lastly, I'll be explaining how the civil rights movement changed in the way that we learn today. While total equality in education has not been achieved for African Americans, the civil rights movement led to the improvement of the quality of Black schools, and the end of segregation meant that Black students could enroll to universities at a higher rate. The effect of this today has seen an increased population of educated African Americans and more college enrollment university numbers. In addition to an improvement in the African American education, the civil rights movement inspired change in educational standards for other minorities. For example, there has been an increase in women enrolled in traditionally male-dominated fields, and the educational performance of women has increased quite significantly. Education disparities for African American students still exist today as they did in the past, but African American students are subject to more disciplinary actions, smaller curriculums due to funding, and a wide disparity in course availability that lessens educational opportunities. Thank you.